Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Great to see that you're already here, and I hope you're as excited about the conference as I am. I want to also say a big thank you to the organizers for hosting this conference. Yet again, it's massive work, so a lot of respect to them. I'll be discussing climate change from a justice-based perspective. Now, mainly I want to defend the claim that climate activism, or climate change rather, is a matter of intersectionality. Now, if my claim is correct, and justice for all and human and non-human animal rights are indeed our locus of concern, then we should include climate action in our vegan activism. Too often I see vegan organizations claim that eating meat and dairy is very bad for the environment, and of course they're correct to claim so. But why are they using this argument? Can they claim that they live in an environmental friendly way? Because we wouldn't think that a meat eater who's doing vegan outreach would be very credible, right? So what with vegans who fly around the world for leisure or just for fun, while at the same time using the environment as an argument to go vegan? Now, the science I'm using in my talk is not controversial. The studies I refer to are conducted by leading scientists and are published by acclaimed journals or renowned scientific institutions and intergovernmental institutions. And also, in the ethical claims I'm making, I'm trying to be as least controversial as I possibly can. Now, why do I do this? Well, because the harder, or the more basic my claim is, rather, the more hard it is to refute. So in my talk, I will only use one assumption, which is difficult to scientifically prove, and I will make one equation that you might think is a bit dubious, but I'll point it out when I get there. I close off with a call to action, and as I will explain, such an activism for us will not be easy. If you think there's a lot of disparity in the vegan community or in the animal rights scene, wait until you check out those advocating climate action. I'll kick off with an update on climate change, but I'll promise not to spend too much time on numbers, graphs, and statistics. So I hope this is clear. First, I'll be discussing climate change, like I said. Then I will discuss intersectionality. I'll say something about our ethical framework, and I'll comment on what I think we should do in practice. So here it goes. Climate change, as you might already know, of course, is happening. The science really is overwhelmingly clear. Since the Industrial Revolution, human-made greenhouse gases have resulted in a temperature increase of 0.85 degrees Celsius. And that, of course, is a world average. In the EU alone, we're witnessing a temperature increase of 1.3 degrees Celsius. Now, please keep these numbers in mind for a bit. Sea levels are rising, ice caps are melting, patterns of precipitation are changing, and certain parts of the world are already experiencing more droughts. Current levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have not occurred in 800,000 to 15 million years. As you might know, 2015 was the hottest year on record. The hottest year before that was 2014. And as you see on the right-hand side, I hope that's clear, that the years in which heat records were broken have roughly all taken place within the last 2 decades. Even more so, last July, so 2 months ago, was the 15th month in a row to break the monthly heat record. And of course, the changes we're seeing now are a result from emissions from some time in the past. But since 1990 to 2008, greenhouse gas emissions globally have risen 58%. Now, the largest historic emitters are, of course, we and the West. But in recent years, China has topped the United States as being the world's biggest greenhouse gas polluter. Now, when we hear about climate change in the media, mostly once a year when a climate summit is coming, we hear that number of 2 degrees Celsius being repeated over and over again. Why is that? Well, 2 degrees signifies a certain amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that's an amount we need to avoid at all costs, although, spoiler alert, we've already crossed that level. To steer away from 2 degrees temperature rise in 2100, atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases should not top 350 to 400 parts per million. Last time I checked, we were at 403 parts per million, and you see that the number is going up. Now, why is this so very alarming? Well, 2 degrees is seen as a tipping point. So when we reach the 2 degrees, we've reached the tipping point. And on that tipping point, dangerous feedback mechanisms will kick in, and this will lead to what scientists call runaway climate change. Now, allow me to illustrate what these feedback mechanisms will look like. I'll give you 2 examples. Which shirt is more warmer when the sun is shining? You might know from the weather outside. A black shirt or a white shirt? the black one, of course. That's because the darker the surface, the more heat it absorbs. Now, the same goes for our planet. The ice caps are melting, so the Earth's surface is becoming more dark. That makes the temperatures increase, which makes the ice melt, which makes the Earth's surface more dark. So the temperature, the planet absorbs more heat, which makes the temperature increase, which makes the ice melt, and so on. The second example is the permafrost, so the permanently frozen layers in the north. They're not very aptly named, so it appears, because the permafrost is melting in a number of places. Now, throughout the centuries, enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, and specifically CO2 and CH4, that's methane, have been encapsulated in these different layers of the permafrost. Now that the permafrost is melting, it's releasing, and it will release these greenhouse gases. When released, they'll add to climate change, of course, which makes the temperature increase, which makes the permafrost melt, so it releases more greenhouse gases. So it adds to climate change, which makes the temperature increase, which makes the permafrost melt, and so on. From these two examples, it shows which kind of snowball effect we'll witness when we cross that 2 degrees boundary. Runaway climate change means that the speed and the magnitude of that phenomenon, of climate change, will keep on increasing. Indeed, runaway climate change is to be avoided at all costs, and even international leaders have acknowledged this. Now, in order to have a reasonable chance to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, global emissions would have to peak and decline before the end of this decade. I'll say that again. To have a reasonable chance, and a reasonable chance is 66% probability to limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, our emissions have to reach their maximum and then go back down before the end of this decade. That leaves us another 4 years. Now, whether that's a realistic prognosis is another thing. No, I don't think it is, but this is what science is telling us. Research indicates that the window of opportunity to steer clear from that 2 degrees increase is decreasing rapidly. Studies consider a temperature increase of 4 degrees Celsius by 2100 to be at least more likely than a 2 degrees increase. And I've just explained to you why that is catastrophic. To stay within that 2 degrees boundary, of the known reserves, 88% of all our coal, half of all our gas, and a third of all oil should remain in the ground, of the known reserves. Right, so far the statistics and the projections on the physical phenomena. But the sad news I'm bringing you is not over, I'm afraid. Now, when I cross-reference some of the fields of intersectionality with the projected damages and harms that will be brought about by climate change, I think that climate change is unmistakably a matter of intersectionality. I'll discuss these fields of intersectionality, but mind you, this list is, of course, not exhaustive. It's quite limited, frankly. So I'll discuss women's rights, global justice, classism and poverty, ageism and ableism, human rights, and of course, animal rights. First up, women's rights. When it comes to the effects of climate change on society, the impact is mediated by social factors. That means that how much you'll be affected by climate change depends on the social role that you're in. Women are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than men, primarily because they make up the majority of the world's poor and are more dependent for their livelihoods on natural resources. Those natural resources are threatened by climate change. Women face social, economic, and political barriers that limit their ability to cope with climate change. When coupled with their unequal access to resources and decision-making processes, limited mobility places women, especially in rural areas, so in areas dependent on agriculture, in a position where they will be disproportionately affected by climate change. Already, globally, natural disasters kill more women than men, and they tend to kill women at a younger age. Women are more at risk of dying in heat waves, windstorms, tropical cyclones, sea level rise, heavy rain, flooding, and of course, droughts. In non-industrialized countries, or what others call developing countries, women will be most affected by climate change, since they are often dependent on rain-fed agriculture. In these countries, and specifically in Southeast Asia, women comprise of 43% of the agricultural labor force. So to women, agriculture is an important source of employment and therefore survival. Yet in these regions, because of climate change, agriculture will become very difficult and in certain parts even impossible. So these women will be robbed of their means of subsistence and little to no independence they have. It is estimated that non-industrialized countries are likely to bear 75% of cost of damages resulting from climate change. Today, we see these emerging economies, as they're called, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, we see them add as much to the problem as the industrialized countries because of their high emission rates. But we have to keep in mind that the West, or the North, has been emitting for a far greater period in time. Now, to make matters worse, although everyone will experience climate change's consequences, the poorest countries will suffer most, if only due to their geographic location or their poverty rate, their health system, their social system, and so on. So those least responsible for the problem will bear the greatest burdens. Now, the poor suffering most is wrong, no matter which account of justice you have. I hope you can read this. It's by Steven van der Heijden. He's a researcher in the States. And he says, well, the global poor, despite their disproportionately small share for causing this problem, and they're receiving little or no benefit from those activities that have caused the problem, are nonetheless expected to suffer disproportionately from a changing climate. Thus, the predicted consequences of unabated emissions include the shifting of the ecological cost of the lifestyle of the world's affluent, that's us, onto those who can least afford to bear those costs, are least responsible for producing them, and have received least advantage from them. Climate change will slow down and even reverse decades of human development in non-industrialized countries. It is estimated that the number of people living in extreme poverty by 2050 would top 3.1 billion. If the political right wing in Europe is worried about Syrians at its doorstep, it's in for a serious wake-up call. Between 2008 and 2012, 83% of displacement, so migration, was triggered by climate and weather-related hazards. Fatality rates due to weather and climate disasters are already higher in non-industrialized countries. And specifically in Africa and Asia, climate change will worsen existing threats to human security, which include food, health, and economic insecurity. As said, societal factors tell us a lot about the harm that will occur. And I've already discussed gender. Yet when looking at age and ability, we see that those are crucial factors when we're looking at harm. By 2050, the number of undernourished children under the age of 5 will rise with 20 to 25 million. That's 1/5 of the total amount. Another example is the European heat wave of 23, which was probably the hardest in Europe since at the latest the 16th century, and which resulted in no less than 70,210 heat-related deaths across Western Europe. Now, the likelihood of such heat waves is to increase 100-fold over the next 4 decades. And especially children under 5, the elderly population, and those with feeble health are expected to be most affected. Furthermore, it is predicted that by the end of this century, the frequency of heat waves will change from 1 heat wave in every 3 to 5 summers to 2 to 3 heat waves each summer by the end of the century. From what I've just illustrated, it's not surprising that 3 basic human rights are severely threatened by climate change, being the right to life, the right to subsistence or survival, and the right to health. It should be clear that the background circumstances needed to fulfill these rights will be absent. If a woman needs to provide for herself through agricultural labor, and agriculture isn't possible, then a human right is a right in name only. These background circumstances, so an hospitable environment or workable land or the absence of extreme temperatures and floods, these background circumstances are vital and necessary conditions for the fulfillment of rights. Esther Rajan-Pachauri, the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, said, "Nobody on this planet is going to be untouched by the impacts of climate change." Now, of course, Pachauri was referring to human animals, not non-human animals. The research on how animals will be affected is very, very slim. Indeed, the research is anthropocentric by definition. I will therefore make one observation which is based on scientific and popular evidence, and I will make one claim that's purely an assumption. First, biodiversity loss. We're witnessing the 6th mass extinction of species, as is illustrated on the bottom left of the graph here. Researchers have mapped how much of the natural resources we can use without permanently degrading them. So the green part in the middle is the safe operating space. As you can see, biodiversity loss is literally and figuratively off the chart. Now, climate change will worsen and speed up this process. As Dr. Jane Goodall said, it's not just species facing extinction, it's massive individual suffering. And I'm afraid she's correct. Whether or not it's because of habitat loss due to fragmentation or diseases or invasive species, droughts or extreme weather phenomena, animals will see the background circumstances which they need to thrive disappear. When that happens, they cannot feed themselves. They have no place to rear their offspring. They simply have no place to live. I'll illustrate that with two examples, one specific and one more abstract. Now, I could be giving you a whole lot of examples because the research really on this topic is really increasing. I could be discussing how salmon is dying out in certain parts of the States, or how 35,000 walruses beached on Alaska's shore last year, with which they set a record. Or I could be discussing how plankton in some parts of the ocean is disappearing. But here's my specific example then. In January 2015, 3,110 sea lion pups washed up on California's coast. Now, as some of you might know, experts say that sea lions stranding up at beaches isn't that uncommon. Yet in this particular case, there were 15 times as many sea lion pups being washed up. And in fact, not only California had been experiencing this problem, all over the West Coast, the number of stranding sea lions was increasing. The two previous mass strandings date back to 2014 and 2013. My more abstract example then. Estimates show that with a 1.5 degrees temperature increase, small island states such as the Maldives or the Caribbean, or islands in the Caribbean rather, are threatened to be submerged because of sea level rise. Indeed, we will see climate refugees in the future if they're not with us already. Now, these people will lose their homes, their neighborhoods, their communities, their cultures, their institutions. But frankly, their right to life, health, and subsistence can certainly be respected, if only due to our joint effort to harbor these people. Yet, if large parts of the island disappear underwater, what will happen to wildlife? Where will the animals go? These two examples support my fairly straightforward conclusion that under climate change's consequences, animals will suffer. And again, although there are very few figures at hand, if a heat wave in Western Europe killed that many people, it's not unreasonable to think that many non-human animals in feeble health suffered that same fate. And here's my untested, unscientific assumption that isn't necessarily linked with climate change. Where human animals suffer, non-human animals suffer as well. If humans have to flee dire circumstances which make it impossible for them to live and prosper, chances are pretty high that animals cannot thrive in such circumstances as well. If you want an excellent example of this that has nothing to do with climate change necessarily, then I wholeheartedly recommend that you attend a lecture today in this room by Palestinian Animal League. I attended their lecture last year, and I was truly amazed with the work that these people do, especially considering the circumstances they have to work and live in. They also have a stall here at the Center Hall. If you are able, please consider to support them. Right, so now I've tried to show that when considering women's rights, global justice, classism and poverty, ageism and ableism, human and non-human animal rights, it should be clear that climate change is indeed a matter of intersectionality. Now, when advocating human and non-human animal rights, we should be very clear about the extent of our ethical framework. We're not talking about utilitarianism or the capabilities approach. We're talking about a rights-based approach. And rights are universal in time and space. A woman living in Peru right now has the same moral worth as I do. That's obvious, right? Now, if that spatial difference between me and that woman doesn't matter, neither does her position in time. In other words, a person living 50 years from now has the same moral worth as I do now. Morally, the time difference is as irrelevant as a spatial difference. If we have a concern for the well-being of the Peruvian woman now, we should have a concern for the woman living 50 years from now. Again, rights are universal in time and space. Now, this rights perspective we apply to non-human animals as well. Of course, we believe that a pig in China should have the same rights as a pig living with us here in Belgium, well, where I come from. And the pig living in the future should have the same rights as a pig living with us now. Whether they suffer now or in the future is simply not relevant. The question is whether they will suffer, not when. And that framework is inherent to the work that we as animal campaigners, animal rights campaigners do. For instance, when we with Bite Back picket a slaughterhouse, we know that we will not be able to save these beautiful creatures from what is about to happen to them. Confronted with pigs in those trucks, we could not help. We tried to raise awareness, and basically, we stood there for the pigs of the future. Now, the same goes when we do outreach. We're doing so that animals in the future will be free from harm. Now, if we know of the calamity, the other disaster that's going to happen, and we know that the background circumstances that are needed to fulfill basic rights will not be met, then for the animals, we need to fight climate change. Again, without certain background circumstances, there can be no fulfillment of rights. There can be no life free from harm. So in my view, if you're vegan for the animals, you should be a vegan for the climate. There should be no difference between an ethical vegan and a climate vegan. Both are vegan for ethical reasons. In my view, they're one and the same. Without an environment, there can be no rights. It is a primary condition that needs to be fulfilled if we want human and non-human animals to enjoy rights and well-being. Now, what does this say about the way we live our lives? I could spend the rest of my talk discussing climate policies or what your government is or isn't doing, but instead I want to talk about what we as individuals do. More so, I want to talk about what we as vegans, animal rights campaigners, and activists are doing. When it comes to cruelty to animals, of course we're not waiting until the political world is on our side. Or we're not waiting until you can't buy meat in the stores anymore to go vegan or to persuade people for animal liberation. So why would we wait for climate action from our government? It is we who are leading by example. We're showing the world that we can live happy and healthy lives without harming others. We are the living examples of change. We are morality put into practice. We show that our bodies are not graveyards, and by instigating a multiplier effect or a spillover effect, we can make a difference that actually counts. In our lives, even in past years, we've seen more and more people ditch meat and dairy, or even reduce their consumption. And yes, the prospects of the rise in meat and dairy aren't looking good. The World Health Organization estimates that by 2050, the demand for meat and dairy will double. Yet, as activists, I think that it's time we broaden our horizon. This ethical do no harm claim, or this justice for all moral baseline of ours, should include human and non-human animals living in the future. As vegans, we need to engage in climate action. If you have arguments not to engage in climate action, please check whether those arguments aren't similar to arguments for not going vegan. The argument I hear most often is, I'm already doing my bit by going vegan. Because I'm vegan, my emissions are way down. But isn't that the same sort of argument as, I already eat less meat, which is an argument many of us here think is not good enough? The fact of the matter is that emissions from meat and dairy account for 14 to 20% of greenhouse gases. Now, I know there's one study who says that's 50%, but that's just one study. Remember that I'm relying on the scientific consensus. So that means that by eating a plant-based diet, we're only partially contributing to the solution of stopping climate change. Indeed, we can do a lot better, and I think we should do a lot better. If our climate activism extends only to our diets, we're still contributing to a very great extent to a phenomenon that will hurt human and non-human animals alike. Now, I know that this isn't an easy conclusion to accept, and I will bring in some nuance, but let me dig a bit deeper. Veganism is a lifestyle, I don't need to tell you this. It encompasses very much more than food alone. If that's true, and climate action is part of our veganism, which is a point I'm trying to make, then as vegans, we should be focusing on our entire carbon footprint. And I grant you, some climate action is really beyond our reach and is indeed a matter for the government. Which energy-generating facilities are allowed in your country is beyond your grasp as an individual. But the limitedness of your grasp as an individual doesn't stop us when it comes to animal abuse. Indeed, we see climate activism on the rise. For instance, by drawing public attention to the effects of coal plants on the left-hand side at a coal plant in Germany, or extra runways at airports on the right-hand side in Heathrow, London Airport. Now, I can't discuss all of our actions that are climate unfriendly. But let me take one example. And I could be discussing how you heat your homes or where you buy your electricity from. But for now, let's focus on aviation. Transport emissions account for roughly 14% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And aviation takes up 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you might say, well, what's 5%? But bear with me for a moment. A flight from London to New York and back is the equivalent of a person's transport emissions for an entire year. If we were to place every single person on that plane in separate cars and make them drive the equal distance, then they would still be emitting less than when flying. Furthermore, aviation emissions are steadily on the rise. From 2005 to 2010, only aviation emissions grew 11%. And flying is the individual choice par excellence. In other words, no matter what your government is doing, flying that plane is your choice. Some may argue, well, me not flying to New York is not going to stop climate change. And that's true, that's completely true. Your emissions are necessary nor sufficient to instigate climate change. But you not eating the muscle tissue of a lamb isn't going to stop the meat industry. Then why do you do so? Why do you refrain from eating lamb? Well, you might say for the reasons you just said, the positive spillover effect, or the fact that my body is in the graveyard, or the multiplier effect. But these things go for climate action as well. Again, what matters at the end of the day is our entire carbon footprint. Yes, low-cost airlines are way cheaper than traveling by train. I live in a very small country, Belgium. Now, the amount of money to take me from one side of the country to the other by train equals the price of a low-cost airline ticket to fly me across Europe. Yet, if being vegan meant that you'd have to spend more of your budget on food and clothes and whatever, which is the case today for most of us, would you stop being vegan? So aviation is a real climate killer. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves the question, and this is that dubious claim I warned you about in the beginning. Is eating meat the same as flying a plane? Now, I have a yes part and a no part to that question. I'll start with the yes part. Yes, it is. Emissions from a long-haul flight are roughly higher than that of a single steak. Furthermore, emissions are zero-sum. That means that there's an absolute total maximum of emissions we can safely emit without instigating runaway climate change. If we top that maximum, if we top that sum, then we're instigating runaway climate change. So the amount of emissions we can safely emit beneath that sum, let's call them safe emissions, we have to divide among the world's population so that each has their fair share of emissions. Of course, depending on the circumstances you live in, but that's another discussion. If we divide those safe emissions among all people, then you would be using up more than your fair share by flying planes excessively. Especially since in the West, we're already using up more than that fair share, and remember, we're already in the danger zone of runaway climate change. For instance, citizens of several African countries take between 0.01 and 0.1, I don't know how that's possible, but flights per person per year. While in wealthy countries, we take between 1 and 10 flights per person per year. So although aviation emissions only count for 5%, we're flying a lot more. We're using up more than that fair share. Indeed, we are emitting disproportionately. And the third reason why it's yes is you could be using other means of transportation, or you could satisfy that desire in another way. I'll come back to that last bit. So that was the yes part of the answer. Now the no part. There is a possibility of offsetting. If you fly a plane but cut your emissions drastically in your energy use at home, for instance, you could compensate for the emissions of your plane travel. Say you pay for planting a number of trees, or you pay for clean cooking stoves in India, thereby eliminating the emissions of black soot, which is a type of very harmful carbon emissions which harm women specifically and the climate more generally. Then you could cancel out the emissions of that flight. Now, offsetting is something we cannot do when it comes to animals. Nobody would accept that for me. In order for me to eat a steak, I would have to save 3 cows from the dairy industry. That just doesn't make sense. So yes, in climate friendliness, there is a trade-off which doesn't exist when we are trying to save animals. However, compensating for emissions is not the same as reducing emissions. Remember that our emissions have to peak and decline, not just stagnate. The second point of nuance is we are completely carbon locked in. That means that today, whatever we do, we're emitting greenhouse gases. Virtually all products we consume involve emissions. Whether it's the production of this laptop, or attending conferences, or heating our homes, or enjoying that well-deserved holiday, our entire economy is based on fossil fuel production and consumption. So virtually everything we do contributes to climate change. It cannot be expected of us to live like hermits or to live like Little House on the Prairie. In this system, when we're trying to pursue happiness, which is our given right, in this system we're emitting greenhouse gases. There's no getting around it. And closely related to that point, there are legitimate reasons to emit greenhouse gases. If we stopped emitting greenhouse gases yesterday, then we wouldn't be able to attend this conference and meet other inspiring activists. Or more pressing, Doctors Without Borders wouldn't be able to help refugees in Europe and in Syria. Or Sea Shepherd wouldn't be able to defend animals and habitats in our oceans. There is absolutely no good reason to eat meat and dairy, but we do have very good reasons to emit greenhouse gases. So no, eating a steak is not the same as flying a plane. However, I think it comes down to the attitude behind those two behaviors. The more you use aviation for non-necessary reasons or goods, or you refuse to use alternatives, the more flying resembles eating meat. Both harbor a fundamental indifference, one towards the environment and the other towards animals. And as I've tried to explain, the environment is primordial to animal rights. So an indifference towards the environment will result in an indifference towards animals. No, vegan travel, as is depicted here, is not a contradiction in terms. But ordering that latest brand of meat replacements from the state because it's brand new, or your vegan shirt and shoes flown across the world, needing your South American avocado on a daily basis, or short-haul flights to Berlin to visit your favorite vegan restaurant and whatnot, thereby neglecting the ethical and ecological cost of that behavior, and while at the same time advocating veganism, in my opinion, is a contradiction in terms. Now, I understand that as vegans, we're finally coming in from the cold, right? We're no longer that marginalized group of people. Finally, we're making it into the mainstream. But this vegan thing of ours cannot become this yuppie privileged behavior with which we say, as long as it's vegan, it's okay because it didn't cause any harm. Because that should be clear by now, that simply isn't true. Last year, I heard a speaker at this conference saying there is no alternative to flying, possibly implying that if there is no alternative, then it cannot be expected of me to stop doing it. Now that statement really stuck with me, and it resonated in my head when I read the book Ethics and the Environment by a philosopher called Dale Jameson. I really recommend that book. It made me ask the question, there's no alternative to what? In other words, we try to achieve happiness through different means. Through different means, I try to be happy. That's our ultimate goal, right? And although that end certainly is fixed, what else is there than happiness? The means to achieve that end certainly aren't fixed. And that's exactly what we should be questioning in every facet of our lives. Can other means help me achieve that most desired end? No, there already is an alternative to flying, but flying was a means to achieve that end. To go to Portland because it's officially vegan heaven, or to visit a sanctuary in the US, or flying to Australia because, well, everyone's doing it. We do these things to make us happy. Now, that given end can be reached and satisfied by more than one sort of means alone. It is indeed what we prioritize, what we value as most important, which is exactly why we change our lifestyles and went vegan. We value the life of animals above other preferences. We've learned to look for means other than meat and dairy, or fashionable leather, or entertainment at the circus and whatnot. We've come to realize that the lives of animals are more important. And I think that if we prioritize justice for all, then we'll have no trouble finding other means to make us happy. Climate change is about how we ought to live. What kind of societies do we want, and how should we relate to the natural environment? Climate change really is a problem that concerns our values. What do we value in this world, and what are we prepared to do for those values? Surely, these values must be worth looking for other means to become happy. Other means that show that we care about the environment and therefore human and non-human animals of the future. Now, to close off, I want to briefly refer to a specific example of how we should broaden our activism. Although it will not be easy, and I think that many of you will disagree with me, I think we should join the green ranks. I think we should join environmentalists and ecologists. Now, I know, ecological organizations hardly talk about eating meat and dairy, and we've all seen Cowspiracy, right? In fact, their blindness really is gut-wrenching. On the left-hand side, 6 of the eco-friendliest meats you can buy by the Sierra Club. Or on the right-hand side, the Greens of Europe, intensive production, this cow needs grass, trust the Greens on animal rights, I kid you not. And in the bottom, WWF, a campaign to stop food waste and thereby normatizing the most harmful goods environmentally wise on the planet. Yet, these organizations, and I'm not claiming you should join WWF, but these organizations aspire to fight climate change. And at least that goal we should have in common. In my experience, environmentalists are open to our message. In my country, we've hosted several screenings of Cowspiracy with the Greens, and they keep coming back for more, as we're as surprised as you are. We're now organizing a screening of racing extinction, for instance. Now, on those screenings, we reach out to them about veganism, and we press forward on the need to tackle environmental problems. And please keep in mind, although it's for different reasons, they're looking for ways to fight climate change. If we include climate action in our vegan activism, then in that regard, we're fighting for the same goal. Although most of them are still carnistically blind and they think that grass-fed beef is okay, they're the audience we can force to look at their own ways, because as ecologists, at some point in their life, they already had to change their ways. So my advice is we reach out to them and we spread this vegan message of ours. We learn from them on environmental issues. Climate change really is a supreme emergency. If we do not act now, the problem will keep on getting bigger and bigger and it will become a lot more difficult to fight. If we do not act now, more and more human and non-human animals will suffer. The challenge we face is enormously great and very pressing, but so is animal liberation, and not for 1 second we doubt that we must fight for that cause. If this generation fails at reducing emissions and we don't spread this message, we don't seize that declining opportunity to steer clear from climate change's worst consequences, well, we have the best means to do so and we know most of this problem, then rightly so, future human and non-human animals will consider us to be a generation of free riders who knew about the problem, who fought a good fight, but who weren't inclusive of future human and non-human animals. Let us be known as this community, this group of people that urge the generation to stand up, to take responsibility in the eyes of this awakening calamity. Let us be the generation that truly demanded justice for all.
Thank you for that wonderfully researched and presented talk. Now we have 10 minutes for Q&A. Has a question? Wave your arm wildly. There we go.
Thanks. Well, thanks again. I thought it was great what you said. And what I wanted to ask, unfortunately, it's not even the questions, the kind of remarks you sometimes get. But it's because everything in what you said completely convinced me, just in the one thing when you said that human suffering would always lead to animal or other animals suffering. Mm-hmm. I found immediately in my mind 2 contrary examples, which of course don't disprove your point at all.
No, of course.
But I was thinking, for example, of Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. I heard that around Chernobyl people have moved away because of the radiation. Mm-hmm. And apparently also animals have suffered from the radiation. But at the same time, wildlife is flourishing.
Yeah, I saw that article as well. That's really interesting. Yeah, indeed.
And the same goes for Brandenburg, where there's it's like an area in Germany, a province, and there used to be lots of military training. And it's so much military training that the ground is full of ammunition and things which can explode. Mm-hmm. So the hunters don't dare enter. And the boars Perfect. And the wild pigs, it's nice. They actually know where the stuff is. And occasionally a pig will explode. Mm-hmm. But for the rest, they're really safe because, humans don't dare going there. Yeah. So I feel that sometimes, we could think that maybe...
Thanks for that. Those are really good counterexamples. Of course, we have to take in consideration that for that to happen, there first was a nuclear disaster in Chernobyl. But of course, if we can create these zones in which humans stay clear and animals can thrive, that would be perfect. But that's a good counterpoint to my unscientific claim. Yeah, thanks for that.
First, thanks a lot for your talk. I wanted to ask if the conclusion that we as animal rights activists also have to fight climate change or be opposed to climate change, how does it change if we take into account wild animal suffering, like that the majority of animals right now, they're living in nature, and if there's evidence that the majority of them are suffering due to natural processes, is there a possibility that climate change might actually change ecosystems in a way that wild animals suffer less and therefore give us an argument to oppose your conclusion?
Yeah, that's a good question. The problem is that climate change, normally animals adapt to the circumstances changing. But in this case, climate change is moving too fast for animals to adapt. So we see that, for instance, in certain parts around the equator, that animals cannot, where they used to live, they cannot live there anymore. So, and like I said, because some animal species or insects are migrating towards other regions of the world, we see that biodiversity is threatened by invasive species and diseases. So climate change is moving too fast. If it were to go a lot slower and in a theoretical realm where we would be fine and the animals would be fine, maybe it would be so that in a changing environment they could thrive in it, but that's sadly the case today, as my examples of the sea lion pups or the walruses in Alaska clearly showed. In the front. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I started as a feminist and then became a feminist environmentalist, and now I'm a feminist environmentalist vegan.
Very good for you.
Yeah. Thank you. So I found your talk very, very interesting, and I share most of it, and almost all of it, except I'm missing the feminist dimension here, which is something about the way we organize our human society and the kind of machismo that has created the kind of climate change you were talking about. Could you say something about this intersectionality? And we need to, as environmentalists and as vegans, we need to reach out to the feminist movement and vice versa. I know it's starting, but it's not enough, and there's still fears of touching each other, so to speak.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. That's a very good remark, and I really should include that in my talk. Now, I thought I covered that basis a little by discussing how women will be affected, particularly by climate change. But indeed, if a solution is at hand, it should be inclusive, and it really should take up women's rights. Of course it should, yeah. I hear a lot of times when I do talks like this, people start talking to me about overpopulation, and which is always a remark that comes from a white Western male in the audience. And indeed, as many research has shown, overpopulation is simply a matter of lack of women's rights. So indeed, I have to include that. Thanks for that remark. Most useful.
Yeah, thank you. I also agree with all of what you said, actually. But nice. One thing I thought is, I was a bit, or I thought if the emphasis is right, because you talked a lot about personal lifestyles, and I think it's important, and I think we shouldn't fly as little, we should fly as little as possible, etc. But I think if we really look at climate change and its causes, it also shows us that we need to change the system that is behind it, and so that activism part at the end and joining with the Greens, and I think also we should join the Greens and particularly the system change and grassroots organizations and not the World Wildlife Fund and these guys, because in my view they're not attempting to change these underlying causes. Of course.
Yeah, it's what in this conference Jake Conroy will be speaking, and his emphasis is on how we should, focus on intersectionality. Our lives aren't, I don't know where the quote comes from, but our lives aren't non-intersectional, but the fight surely should be. So I agree with you. We have to make liaisons between different movements of emancipation. And if we do so, then only then the solution can become all-inclusive, of course. Yeah, I totally agree. But I just want to say one more thing about that. A lot of people tell me, well, this is the fall of capitalism. And so that immediately puts off a lot of most center-mind thinkers. And sadly, I think that the solution we need a solution right now for climate change. And we can't wait until capitalism is out of the way to start advocating environmental rights, for instance. So I think that we should keep an open mind as possible, simply because, well, we don't have time we can't afford installing this. So the solution will come from the mindset that is dominant in this decade or in this era. More questions?
Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting seeing some points being brought back to mind that, well, maybe we should have in mind more often. There was one point, though, that I didn't agree with right at the start. You said that you couldn't argue that veganism was more environmentally friendly while not being environmentally friendly yourself. Mm-hmm. And I would disagree with that, because I think that veganism being more environmentally friendly, given all other facts being equal, is a fact. Mm-hmm. And you can argue with facts despite not like thinking that the environment is important for yourself. The same as a meat eater can argue that veganism would be more environmentally friendly. Of course, he'll probably be less convincing, but the argument is still valid.
Yes, of course, the argument is valid, but it's about, I think it's about credibility. That if we wouldn't believe that meat eater, we wouldn't think he's very credible or she's very credible when she's advocating that point. And I think that if a vegan outreacher approaches you and they're known as a avid traveler and they don't care about their air miles or the ecological cost of their plane travels, then would make them, I think, less credible. The point is still valid, I agree, but it would make them less credible when they start talking about the environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. So, yeah, you're not, yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a valid point. Thanks.
One more question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Especially, I fully agree with this aspect of including climate change as a very, very big threat. I think the biggest threat that we're facing. And I think it's very important to look further than veganism. I agree with that. So there's only a little bit of a side issue that I'm alienated when I listen to you. And this side issue is you did this comparison between eating a steak and flying an airplane. And to me, it seems that the basic assumption for your arguments is utilitarianism.
Sorry?
Utilitarianism.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And basically, it might be that it's valid to check these utilitarian or consequentialist arguments when it comes to climate change, because there's no basic rights involved. You say in the future, but okay. But I am not vegan for utilitarian reasons, so I feel alienated by this comparison. You can't convince me with utilitarian arguments.
Okay, yeah, good point. All right.
But you use rights theory just as much.
We have 2 minutes left.
You use rights theory just as much, right?
Sorry?
With human.
Yeah. I based my assumption on, but I think Suriskan is referring specifically to the match I make between flying planes and eating meat, and that's indeed a consequentialist stance. Yeah, indeed. And afterwards, I switch back to a rights-based perspective. So it's indeed a valid point. Yeah.
We have time for one more, as long as it's a quick question. Oh, somebody behind you hasn't asked.
Don't you think that in practice might be challenging to try to use ethical arguments? Animals suffer, are sentient, that's what they should have rights. And at the same time, like for me, it's depicting them a bit as just machines creating methanes, and that's the reason why we shouldn't produce them or have them. Yes, I think for me there is a bit of a conflict, and don't you think it might be challenging to use these two kinds of arguments? I hope you understand what.
So you're saying that the argument of referring to ethics wouldn't be effective when reaching out, for instance?
While trying to use these two arguments at the same time, it might be a bit challenging to communicate, because you basically see, for me, animals as polluting machines producing methane. That's the reason why you shouldn't.
Yeah. And you're saying that we should be focusing on animals not because they're methane machines, but because they have inherent rights.
I would say that for communication purposes, it's clearer and it's stronger argument, in my opinion. Yeah,
but maybe the point, well, one of the points I was trying to make is that it's indeed so that animals produce too much, well, livestock produces too much methane, and that would be an argument for to go against meat and dairy, but my talk was directed to us as vegans who already ditched meat and dairy, and then looking at the rest of those greenhouse gases and looking what we can do to them or to our carbon footprint, and then trying to limit this as much as possible just to benefit animals, because that's the point today. When we try to save animals, where we stand at those trucks, we see the pigs, and when we go to sanctuaries, we see animals thriving and being happy, which lifts our spirits, of course. But the point is that, and it's psychological, that we can't imagine the well-being of an animal, of a human or non-human animal, living 50 years from now. We know that they will be there, but to be concerned about them is another matter. So I think that if that spatial difference, like I said, that a spatial difference doesn't matter morally, then as a matter of ethics, we should be concerned about the future human and non-human animals as well. So maybe it's not a great strategic point, because, and that's one of the reasons why climate change is that hard to sell, or climate action is that hard to sell, because whatever we do, we will not see the consequences of our actions. But that same story goes for animal liberation. It might be very well that we will never see all animals liberated. So I think it's a bit of a trade-off, and I think what your public is most receptive to, that's the argument we should use. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Dirix. Let's carry this forward and come back for questions later, and thank you very much.
Okay, have a great conference. See you again.